June 4th, 1942. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath a sky that promised nothing but uncertainty. At 20,000 feet, the air was thin and cold. Inside the cramped cockpit of his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky scanned the horizon through scratched plexiglass. His fuel gauge was dropping, his squadron was scattered, and the Japanese carriers, the entire reason for this mission, were nowhere to be found. Behind him, 32 other dive bombers circled in loose formation, waiting for orders. They had been searching for over an hour. They had flown to the exact coordinates intelligence had provided. But the ocean below was empty. Nothing but whitecaps and shadow. The radio crackled with static and doubt. Some pilots were already suggesting they turn back. Fuel was critical. The carrier was 175 miles away. If they didn't leave soon, they wouldn't make it home. But McClusky didn't turn. Instead, he did something no one had authorized. He saw a lone Japanese destroyer cutting through the water at high speed, heading northeast. It was moving with purpose, urgency, and McClusky made a choice. He banked hard to the right and followed it. That single decision, that unauthorized turn, would lead him straight to the heart of the Japanese fleet and change the course of the entire Pacific War. Who was Wade McClusky? Wade McClusky was not born into the Navy. He grew up in Buffalo, New York, the son of a postal worker and a school teacher. His childhood was ordinary, quiet, filled with books and baseball games in empty lots. He was smart, disciplined, and curious, the kind of boy who took apart alarm clocks just to see how they worked. In high school, he excelled in mathematics and physics. His teachers told him he had a future in engineering. But McClusky wanted something more. He wanted to fly. In 1926, at the age of 17, he applied to the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. He passed the entrance exams with high marks and entered as part of the class of 1926. At Annapolis, McClusky was known as steady, not flashy. He didn't seek attention. He didn't chase glory. He studied navigation, tactics, and leadership with the same quiet intensity he had brought to everything else in his life. His classmates remembered him as someone who listened more than he spoke, who thought before he acted, who could be counted on when things went wrong. After graduation, he served aboard battleships and cruisers, learning the rhythms of naval warfare. He stood watches in the middle of the night, navigated through storms, and learned how to lead men under pressure. But it wasn't until 1936, 10 years into his career, that McClusky found his calling. He volunteered for flight training at Naval Air Station Pensacola in Florida. At 27, he was older than most of the other cadets. Some instructors doubted whether he had the reflexes for carrier aviation. Flying off a carrier was one of the most dangerous jobs in the military. The flight deck was short, the margin for error tiny. One mistake and you could crash into the ocean or slam into the back of the ship. But McClusky proved them wrong. He wasn't the fastest pilot. He wasn't the most aggressive. But he was precise, calm under pressure, and able to think 3 steps ahead. He understood the mathematics of flight, the physics of lift and drag, the geometry of navigation. He could calculate fuel consumption in his head, estimate wind drift without instruments, and find his way back to the carrier in the dark. By 1940, McClusky had earned his wings and was assigned to the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. He flew fighters first, then transitioned to dive bombers. By early 1942, he had been promoted to lieutenant commander and given command of the Enterprise Air Group, responsible for coordinating all the carrier's aircraft in combat. It was a position of immense responsibility. And on the morning of June 4th, 1942, that responsibility would be tested in ways no one could have imagined. The stakes at Midway. 6 months earlier, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. In a single morning, they had crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, sinking battleships, destroying aircraft, and killing over 2,400 Americans. It was a devastating blow. The attack had been a complete surprise. American radar had detected the incoming aircraft, but the warning was ignored. By the time the bombs started falling, it was too late. The battleships Arizona, Oklahoma, California, and West Virginia were sunk. The Nevada was beached. The Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Tennessee were damaged. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The Pacific Fleet, the backbone of American power in the Pacific, was crippled. But the Japanese didn't stop there. In the months that followed, they swept across the Pacific like a tidal wave. They took the Philippines, where American and Filipino forces fought desperately but were overwhelmed. General Douglas MacArthur was forced to evacuate, famously promising, "I shall return." They took Guam, a tiny American territory in the western Pacific. They took Wake Island, where a small garrison of Marines held out for 2 weeks before being overrun. They took Hong Kong from the British. They took Singapore, supposedly an impregnable fortress, in one of the most humiliating defeats in British military history. They took the Dutch East Indies, with its vital oil fields. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese Empire controlled a vast swath of the Pacific, stretching from the coast of China to the edge of Australia. Their navy was the most powerful in the world. Their pilots were experienced, disciplined, and feared. Their soldiers had a reputation for fanatical courage. The United States, by contrast, was reeling. The Pacific Fleet had been gutted. Reinforcements were months away. The industrial might of America was just beginning to mobilize. Morale was low. Many Americans feared that the Japanese were unstoppable. But American intelligence had one advantage. They had broken the Japanese naval code. By late May 1942, U.S. cryptanalysts had intercepted and decoded Japanese communications, revealing a major operation planned for early June. The target was Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Midway was strategically vital. It was the last American outpost between Japan and Hawaii. If the Japanese took Midway, they could threaten Hawaii itself and force the U.S. to negotiate a peace on Japanese terms. But the Japanese plan was more ambitious than just capturing an island. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, intended to use Midway as bait. He would lure the remaining American carriers into a trap and destroy them in a decisive battle. With the U.S. carriers gone, Japan would dominate the Pacific for years. It was a bold plan, and it almost worked. The Americans, thanks to their intelligence breakthrough, knew the Japanese were coming. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, gathered every available ship and aircraft. He had 3 carriers, the USS Enterprise, the USS Hornet, and the USS Yorktown, which had been hastily repaired after being damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea. Against them, the Japanese had 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and hundreds of aircraft. On paper, the Japanese had the advantage, but the Americans had surprise, and they had men like Wade McClusky. The morning of June 4th. The battle began before dawn. At 4:30 in the morning, Japanese carriers launched their first strike against Midway Atoll. Over 100 aircraft, bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes roared off the flight decks and headed southeast. The American defenders on Midway scrambled to meet them. The sky above the atoll erupted in fire and smoke. Buildings burned, runways cratered. But the Japanese strike didn't achieve its objective. Midway's airfield was damaged but still operational. And more importantly, the American carriers were not at Midway. They were 200 miles to the northeast, hidden by clouds and distance, waiting. At 7 in the morning, Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Enterprise and Hornet, made a critical decision. He ordered an immediate strike against the Japanese carriers. It was a gamble. His pilots would have to fly at the extreme edge of their range. If they didn't find the enemy quickly, they wouldn't have enough fuel to return. But Spruance knew that surprise was everything. If the Japanese discovered the American carriers first, the battle would be lost. At 7:52, the first wave of American aircraft began launching from the Enterprise and Hornet. Torpedo bombers went first, slow and vulnerable, armed with torpedoes that had to be dropped at low altitude. Then came the fighters, sleek F-4F Wildcats tasked with protecting the bombers. And finally, the dive bombers, the SBD, dauntless aircraft, piloted by men like Wade McClusky. McClusky's squadron, Bombing Squadron 6, consisted of 18 aircraft. He also had tactical command over Scouting Squadron 6, another 15 dive bombers. In total, McClusky was responsible for 33 aircraft, the largest strike group launched that morning. His orders were simple. Fly southwest to the coordinates where the Japanese carriers were expected to be. Find them. Destroy them. But nothing about that morning would be simple. McClusky climbed into his cockpit at 7:30. His radio man, Walter Chokalusek, settled into the rear seat. They went through the pre-flight checklist: engine temperature, oil pressure, fuel level, bomb release mechanism. Everything checked out. The 1,000-pound bomb was already loaded under the fuselage. At 7:52, McClusky's engine roared to life. The flight deck crew signaled him forward. The Enterprise turned into the wind, picking up speed. McClusky pushed the throttle forward and raced down the deck. At the end, he pulled back on the stick and lifted into the air. Behind him, 32 other dive bombers followed, one by one, until the entire strike group was airborne. The search begins. McClusky's formation climbed to 20,000 feet and headed southwest. The sky was clear, the ocean below a vast expanse of blue. Visibility was good. Conditions were perfect for a strike. Except for one problem. The Japanese weren't where they were supposed to be. Intelligence had predicted the enemy carriers would be at a specific location based on their course and speed. But by the time McClusky arrived at those coordinates, the ocean was empty. No carriers, no ships, nothing. McClusky circled, scanning the horizon. His pilots did the same. Minutes passed. Fuel gauges dropped. The radio crackled with confusion. Where are they? Did we miss them? Should we turn back? McClusky didn't panic. He was a navigator, trained to think in terms of speed, distance, and time. He calculated. If the Japanese had launched a strike against Midway at dawn, they would have turned into the wind to recover their aircraft. That meant they would have changed course. But which direction? McClusky made an educated guess. He turned northwest, hoping to intercept the enemy. But after 20 minutes of flying, there was still nothing. Fuel was now critical. Some of his pilots were down to 30 minutes of flying time. If they didn't turn back immediately, they wouldn't make it to the carrier. Some would have to ditch in the ocean. McClusky knew the risks. He also knew what was at stake. If they didn't find the Japanese carriers, the enemy would find the American carriers, and the battle, the war, could be lost. So he kept searching. His eyes swept the horizon, looking for anything. A ship, a wake, smoke, anything that might indicate where the Japanese fleet had gone. The sun was climbing higher now. The ocean glittered. The sky was empty except for his own aircraft. And then, at 9:55 in the morning, he saw it. The lone destroyer. It was small, just a white wake cutting through the blue. A single Japanese destroyer, moving fast, heading northeast. McClusky stared at it. Why was it moving so fast? Why was it alone? Destroyers didn't operate alone. They escorted larger ships. They screened carriers. And if this destroyer was heading northeast at high speed, it was going somewhere important. McClusky made his decision. He didn't radio back to the carrier for permission. He didn't consult with his squadron leaders. He simply banked to the right and followed the destroyer. His pilots followed him. Some didn't understand. Some thought he was making a mistake. But they trusted him. They followed. For 10 minutes, McClusky trailed the destroyer, staying high, staying out of sight. His fuel gauge was dropping steadily. Every minute he followed the destroyer was a minute less fuel for the return trip. But McClusky's instincts told him he was right. The destroyer was going somewhere, and that somewhere had to be the carriers. And then, at 10:05, he saw them. 4 Japanese carriers, arranged in a loose box formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The heart of the Japanese fleet. The most powerful naval force in the Pacific. And they were completely vulnerable. The perfect moment. What McClusky didn't know, what no one could have known, was that he had arrived at the single most critical moment of the entire battle. For the past hour, the Japanese carriers had been in chaos. Their strike against Midway had returned, and the carriers were recovering aircraft, rearming them, refueling them. At the same time, Japanese scouts had finally spotted the American carriers. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese fleet, had ordered his planes to be rearmed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for a strike against the American ships. But the rearming process took time. Aircraft were crowded on the flight decks. Bombs and torpedoes were stacked on the hangar decks. Fuel lines were open. The carriers were floating ammunition dumps. And just as the Japanese were preparing to launch their strike, the first wave of American torpedo bombers arrived. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet attacked first. They came in low, slow, without fighter escort. The Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns tore them apart. Of the 15 torpedo bombers in the squadron, 14 were shot down. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived. He spent the next 30 hours floating in the ocean, watching the battle unfold around him. Then came Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise. Same result. Slaughtered. Then Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown. More losses. In total, 41 American torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese carriers that morning. Only 6 survived. Not a single torpedo hit. It was a massacre. The torpedo bombers were too slow, too vulnerable. The Japanese fighters, the legendary Zeros, cut through them like wolves through sheep. The anti-aircraft fire was withering. The American pilots pressed their attacks with incredible courage, flying straight into the teeth of the enemy defenses, knowing they would probably die. And most of them did. But the torpedo attacks had done something crucial. They had drawn the Japanese fighters down to sea level. The sky above the carriers was now clear, and that's when Wade McClusky arrived. The dive. McClusky didn't hesitate. He pushed his nose down and dove. Behind him, 32 other dive bombers followed, screaming down from 20,000 feet at nearly 300 miles per hour. The Japanese carriers grew larger in his windscreen. He could see the red circles on the flight decks, the rows of aircraft, the tiny figures of men running. He picked his target, the Kaga, one of the largest carriers in the Japanese fleet. He dove steeper, faster, the wind screaming past his canopy. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 15,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 5,000 feet. The carrier filled his entire field of vision. He could see individual aircraft, see men on the deck, see the anti-aircraft guns firing up at him. Tracers streaked past his wings. The aircraft shook from the concussion of exploding shells. But McClusky held his dive. Steady, precise. At 2,500 feet, he released his bomb. A 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb falling like a hammer. He pulled up hard, the G-forces crushing him into his seat, the edges of his vision going gray. Behind him, the bomb struck the Kaga's flight deck and punched through. It detonated in the hangar deck, where dozens of armed and fueled aircraft were packed together. The explosion was catastrophic. Fire erupted. Secondary explosions followed. Bombs cooked off. Torpedoes exploded. Within minutes, the Kaga was a blazing inferno. At the same moment, other dive bombers from McClusky's group hit the Akagi, the Japanese flagship. 3 bombs struck in quick succession. One hit near the bridge. Another penetrated the flight deck. The third detonated in the hangar. The Akagi, like the Kaga, was engulfed in flames. A third carrier, the Soryu, was hit by dive bombers from the Yorktown. 3 bombs, 3 hits. The Soryu was doomed. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were destroyed. The battle, which had seemed lost just an hour earlier, had turned completely. And it had turned because Wade McClusky had followed a lone destroyer. The cost. McClusky's fuel gauge was nearly empty. He had just enough to make it back to the Enterprise. Barely. He flew low, conserving every drop of fuel. Around him, other pilots were not so lucky. Some ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean. Some were picked up by destroyers. Some were never seen again. McClusky himself landed on the Enterprise with less than 5 gallons of fuel remaining. His aircraft was riddled with bullet holes. He had been hit by anti-aircraft fire during his dive. Shrapnel had torn through his fuel tank, his wings, his tail. One piece of shrapnel had hit him in the shoulder, tearing through his flight suit and drawing blood. But he had made it. When he climbed out of his cockpit, his hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from exhaustion. He had been flying for over 4 hours. He had made decisions that no manual had prepared him for. And he had just helped win the most important naval battle in American history. But the battle wasn't over. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, was still operational. That afternoon, it launched a strike against the Yorktown, hitting it with bombs and torpedoes. The Yorktown would eventually sink, but American dive bombers found the Hiryu later that day and destroyed it. By the evening of June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers were sinking or sunk. The Japanese fleet, once invincible, was in retreat. The Battle of Midway was over, and the course of the Pacific War had changed forever. What made the difference? Historians have spent decades analyzing the Battle of Midway. They point to intelligence, to luck, to the courage of the torpedo bomber pilots who sacrificed themselves. All of that is true. But one decision stands out above all others: Wade McClusky's decision to follow the destroyer. If he had turned back when his fuel was low, the dive bombers would never have found the Japanese carriers. The torpedo attacks would have failed. The Japanese would have launched their strike against the American carriers. The outcome of the battle, and possibly the war, would have been very different. But McClusky didn't turn back. He trusted his instincts. He followed the evidence. He made a decision that no one had authorized, that no one had ordered, that went against every rule about fuel management and risk. And it worked. Years later, McClusky was asked why he followed the destroyer. He said simply, "It was the only thing that made sense." That's the essence of leadership, not following orders blindly, but understanding the situation, trusting your judgment, and acting decisively even when the outcome is uncertain. The aftermath. Wade McClusky was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions at Midway. The citation read, in part, for extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the line of his profession as commander of the Enterprise Air Group in action against enemy Japanese forces in the Battle of Midway on June 4, 1942, leading the entire group of bombers and scouts of his carrier in a vigorous and determined attack on a Japanese invasion fleet. Lieutenant Commander McClusky, with superb skill and courage, pressed home his attack in the face of tremendous anti-aircraft fire and fierce fighter opposition. His gallant intrepidity and loyal devotion to duty contributed greatly to the success of our forces and were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. But McClusky never sought glory. He continued to serve throughout the war, eventually rising to the rank of Rear Admiral. He commanded air groups, trained pilots, and helped shape the tactics that would carry the Navy through the rest of the Pacific campaign. After the war, he retired quietly. He settled in Maryland, raised a family, and rarely spoke about Midway. When asked about the battle, he would deflect, saying that the real heroes were the torpedo bomber pilots who didn't come home. He died in 1976 at the age of 67. His funeral was small, attended by family and a few old Navy friends. There were no cameras, no reporters. But among those who knew what had happened on June 4, 1942, Wade McClusky was remembered as the man who changed everything. The lessons of Midway. The Battle of Midway is studied in military academies around the world. It's taught as a lesson in intelligence, in timing, in the importance of carrier aviation. But it's also a lesson in decision-making. Wade McClusky had incomplete information. He had limited time. He had fuel running out and pilots questioning his judgment. But he didn't freeze. He didn't panic. He looked at the evidence, made a decision, and acted. That's what separates good leaders from great ones. The ability to act decisively in the face of uncertainty. The willingness to take responsibility for decisions that might be wrong. The courage to trust your instincts when the manual doesn't have an answer. McClusky's decision wasn't reckless. It was calculated. He understood the risks. He knew what was at stake. And he made the choice that gave his country the best chance to win. In war, as in life, there are moments when everything hangs in the balance. Moments when the safe choice is to do nothing, to follow the rules, to wait for orders. But sometimes the right choice is to act, to follow the lone destroyer, to make the unauthorized turn, to trust that your judgment, your training, your instincts will lead you to where you need to be. The destroyer's story. The Japanese destroyer that McClusky followed was the Arashi. It had been detached from the main fleet to hunt for an American submarine that had been spotted earlier that morning. The submarine was the USS Nautilus, which had been shadowing the Japanese fleet and had attempted a torpedo attack. The Arashi had dropped depth charges on the Nautilus, forcing it to dive deep. After the attack, the Arashi's captain was racing back to rejoin the carriers. His ship's wake was a breadcrumb trail leading directly to the heart of the Japanese fleet. The captain had no idea that he was being followed. He had no idea that his urgent dash to rejoin the fleet would doom the very carriers he was trying to protect. In the chaos of battle, small decisions have enormous consequences. The Arashi's captain was simply following orders, trying to rejoin his fleet as quickly as possible. But that decision, combined with McClusky's decision to follow, created a chain of events that changed history. War is full of such moments. A soldier who takes a different path, a pilot who spots something in the distance, a commander who makes a split-second choice. These moments are rarely planned. They're not in the manuals, they're not part of the strategy, but they matter. They matter more than anyone realizes at the time. The human element. One of the most remarkable things about the Battle of Midway is how much it depended on individual human beings making decisions under pressure. The code breakers who deciphered Japanese communications, the intelligence officers who convinced their superiors that Midway was the target, the pilots who flew into the teeth of enemy fire, the mechanics who kept the aircraft flying, the sailors who fought the fires and kept the ships afloat, and Wade McClusky, who followed a destroyer when everyone else wanted to turn back. War is often described in terms of strategy, logistics, and firepower. But at its core, war is about people. People making choices, people taking risks, people trusting each other, people refusing to give up. The Battle of Midway was won not because the Americans had better ships or more aircraft. It was won because individuals, at critical moments, made the right decisions, and sometimes the right decision is the one that no one authorized. The legacy. Today, the Battle of Midway is remembered as the turning point of the Pacific War. After Midway, the Japanese were on the defensive. They never again threatened Hawaii or the American West Coast. The initiative passed to the United States, and it never returned. But the battle is also remembered for the men who fought it. The torpedo bomber pilots who flew into certain death. The dive bomber pilots who pressed home their attacks despite overwhelming odds. The sailors who kept the carriers operational despite damage and exhaustion. And Wade McClusky, the quiet, methodical officer from Buffalo, New York, who made a decision that changed the course of history. There are no statues of McClusky, no monuments, no movies. His name is known to historians and naval officers, but not to the general public. And that's probably how he would have wanted it. Because McClusky didn't fight for glory. He fought because it was his duty. He made decisions because someone had to. And when the moment came, when everything hung in the balance, he trusted his judgment and acted. That's the real lesson of Midway. Not that one man can win a war, but that one decision made at the right moment can change everything. The what-ifs. History is full of what-ifs. What if McClusky had turned back? What if he hadn't seen the destroyer? What if the Japanese had launched their strike 5 minutes earlier? What if the torpedo bombers hadn't drawn the fighters down to sea level? Any one of these variables could have changed the outcome of the battle. If McClusky had turned back, the dive bombers would have returned to the Enterprise without finding the Japanese carriers. The Japanese would have launched their strike against the American carriers. The Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown would have been hit, possibly sunk. The Japanese would have won the Battle of Midway. They would have captured the atoll. They would have threatened Hawaii. The war in the Pacific would have lasted years longer. Tens of thousands more lives would have been lost. The atomic bombs might have been used differently, or not at all. The post-war world would have looked very different. All because of one decision, one unauthorized turn. That's the weight that Wade McClusky carried. He didn't know it at the time. He was just trying to find the enemy. But his decision, made in a moment of uncertainty, with fuel running low and time running out, changed the course of the war, and possibly the course of history. The dive bomber. The aircraft that McClusky flew, the Douglas SBD Dauntless, was not glamorous. It was slow, with a top speed of just 255 miles per hour. It was lightly armed, with just 2 forward-firing machine guns and 1 rear-facing gun operated by the radio man. It was cramped, uncomfortable, and cold at high altitude, but it was also incredibly effective. The SBD was a dive bomber designed to attack ships from a steep dive. The pilot would climb to 20,000 feet, then push the nose down and dive at a 70-degree angle, accelerating to over 300 miles per hour. At around 2,500 feet, the pilot would release the bomb and pull up hard, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. It was a terrifying, physically demanding maneuver. But it was also incredibly accurate. A skilled pilot could put a bomb within a few feet of the target. And at Midway, the SBD Dauntless proved its worth. The dive bombers sank 4 Japanese carriers in a single day. They turned the tide of the battle. They changed the war. And they did it because men like Wade McClusky had the skill, the courage, and the judgment to use them effectively. The SBD would go on to serve throughout the Pacific War, sinking more enemy shipping than any other Allied aircraft. It fought at Guadalcanal, at the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz, at the Philippine Sea. It was reliable, rugged, and deadly. Pilots called it slow but deadly. The Japanese called it something else, a name that translated roughly to hell diver, because when the SBDs appeared overhead, death followed. The Japanese perspective. For the Japanese, the Battle of Midway was a catastrophe. They lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of experienced pilots and crew. The carriers could be replaced eventually, but the pilots could not. Japan had started the war with the best trained naval aviators in the world. But training took time, and Japan didn't have time. After Midway, the quality of Japanese pilots declined steadily. By 1944, many Japanese pilots had only a few months of training before being sent into combat. They were no match for the increasingly experienced American pilots. The loss at Midway also shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. For 6 months, the Japanese had swept across the Pacific, seemingly unstoppable. But Midway showed that they could be beaten. It showed that American intelligence, American courage, and American determination could overcome Japanese advantages in experience and equipment. For the Japanese commanders, Midway was a bitter lesson. Admiral Yamamoto, who had planned the operation, was devastated. He knew that Japan had lost its best chance to win the war. He would be killed a year later when American fighters, guided by decoded intelligence, shot down his aircraft over the Solomon Islands. The Japanese Navy never recovered from Midway. It fought on for 3 more years, but it was always on the defensive, always reacting, never again able to seize the initiative. The Intelligence War. One of the unsung heroes of the Battle of Midway was the intelligence team led by Commander Joseph Rochefort. Working in a basement at Pearl Harbor, Rochefort and his team of codebreakers had spent months deciphering Japanese naval communications. By late May 1942, they had broken enough of the code to predict that the Japanese were planning a major operation. But where? The Japanese referred to the target as AF in their coded messages. Rochefort believed that AF was Midway, but not everyone agreed. Some intelligence officers thought AF was Hawaii, or the Aleutian Islands, or even the West Coast. Rochefort needed proof, so he devised a clever trick. He had the garrison on Midway send a fake message, in the clear, reporting that their water desalination plant had broken down. A few days later, Japanese intelligence intercepted and relayed a message stating that AF was short of water. That confirmed it. AF was Midway. Thanks to Rochefort's intelligence, Admiral Nimitz was able to position his carriers northeast of Midway, hidden and waiting. When the Japanese arrived, they walked into a trap. Intelligence didn't win the battle by itself, but it gave the Americans the advantage they needed. It gave them surprise. And in war, surprise is often the difference between victory and defeat. The role of luck. It's tempting to say that the Battle of Midway was won by skill, courage, and intelligence. And all of that is true. But luck also played a role. The Americans were lucky that the Yorktown, damaged at the Coral Sea, was repaired in time to fight at Midway. They were lucky that Japanese scouts failed to spot the American carriers until late in the morning. They were lucky that the torpedo bomber attacks, though they failed, drew the Japanese fighters down to sea level just as the dive bombers arrived. They were lucky that Wade McClusky saw the destroyer. Any one of these things could have gone differently. And if they had, the outcome of the battle might have been very different. But luck favors the prepared. The Americans were prepared. They had broken the Japanese code. They had positioned their carriers. They had trained their pilots. They had maintained their aircraft. And when the moment came, they were ready to take advantage of the opportunities that luck provided. Wade McClusky didn't just get lucky when he saw the destroyer. He was in the right place because he had made good decisions. He had calculated where the Japanese might be. He had kept searching when others wanted to turn back. He had trusted his instincts. And when he saw the destroyer, he recognized it for what it was, a clue, a breadcrumb, a path to the enemy. Luck is important, but it's not enough. You have to be ready to seize it when it comes. The price of victory. The Battle of Midway was a great American victory. But it came at a cost. Over 300 American servicemen were killed. Dozens of aircraft were lost. The Yorktown was sunk. The torpedo bomber squadrons were decimated. For the families of those who died, Midway was not a triumph. It was a tragedy. Wade McClusky understood this. He never celebrated the battle. He never boasted about his role. He knew that victory had been bought with the lives of men who would never go home. In his later years, when asked about Midway, he would always mention the torpedo bomber pilots first. He would talk about their courage, their sacrifice. He would say that they were the real heroes. And he was right. War is not glorious. It's brutal, chaotic, and unforgiving. The Battle of Midway was a turning point, yes, but it was also a reminder of the cost of war. The young men who died in the skies over Midway, the sailors who went down with their ships, the pilots who ditched in the ocean and were never found. They paid the price for victory, and they should never be forgotten. The decision that mattered. In the end, the Battle of Midway came down to a single decision. Wade McClusky's decision to follow the destroyer. It wasn't the only decision that mattered. The codebreaker's decision to focus on Midway. Admiral Nimitz's decision to commit his carriers, Admiral Spruance's decision to launch early, the torpedo bomber pilot's decision to press home their attacks despite overwhelming odds. All of these decisions mattered. But McClusky's decision was the hinge. It was the moment when everything could have gone wrong, but didn't. It was the moment when one man, with incomplete information and limited time, made a choice that changed the course of history. And the remarkable thing is, McClusky didn't know. He didn't know that his decision would lead to the destruction of 4 Japanese carriers. He didn't know that it would turn the tide of the war. He just knew that the destroyer was going somewhere, and he wanted to find out where. That's the nature of leadership. You make decisions without knowing the outcome. You act on incomplete information. You trust your judgment, your training, your instincts, and you hope that you're right. Wade McClusky was right. And because he was, the world is a different place. The Unauthorized Turn. The title of this story is The Dive That Changed the Battle, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky's unauthorized turn at Midway. The word unauthorized is important. McClusky didn't have permission to follow the destroyer. He didn't radio back to the carrier for approval. He didn't consult with his superiors. He just did it. In the military, following orders is paramount. The chain of command exists for a reason. Discipline, coordination, and control are essential. But there are moments when following orders isn't enough. When the situation changes, when the plan falls apart, when the unexpected happens. In those moments, leaders have to make decisions on their own. They have to trust their judgment. They have to act. That's what McClusky did. He saw an opportunity. He took it, and it worked. But it could have gone wrong. If the destroyer had been heading away from the carriers, McClusky would have wasted precious fuel and time. His pilots would have run out of fuel. Some would have died. And McClusky would have been blamed. That's the risk of making unauthorized decisions. If they work, you're a hero. If they don't, you're a failure. McClusky understood the risk, but he also understood that doing nothing was a greater risk. If he turned back, the Japanese carriers would escape. The battle would be lost. So he made the call. He followed the destroyer, and he changed history. The quiet hero. Wade McClusky was not a loud man. He didn't seek attention. He didn't give speeches. He didn't write memoirs. After the war, he lived quietly, worked quietly, and died quietly. But his legacy lives on. In the Naval Academy, where his story is taught to every midshipman. In the history books, where the Battle of Midway is remembered as the turning point of the Pacific War. In the memories of the men who served with him, who knew that they owed their lives to his judgment and his courage. McClusky represents a type of hero that is often overlooked. Not the flashy, charismatic leader who inspires with words, but the quiet, competent professional who inspires with actions. The person who does the job, makes the tough decisions, and doesn't ask for credit. In a world that often celebrates the loud and the bold, it's worth remembering the quiet heroes, the people who do the right thing, not because they want recognition, but because it's the right thing to do. Wade McClusky was one of those people, and the world is better because of him. The final word. On June 4th, 1942, at 9:55 in the morning, Wade McClusky saw a lone Japanese destroyer cutting through the Pacific Ocean. He made a decision. He followed it. 5 minutes later, he found the Japanese carriers. 5 minutes after that, he dove. And in the span of 5 minutes, the course of the Pacific War changed forever. It's a reminder that history is not made by grand strategies or inevitable forces. It's made by individuals, by people making decisions, by people taking risks, by people trusting their judgment. Wade McClusky didn't set out to be a hero. He just set out to do his job. But in doing his job, in making one unauthorized turn, he changed the world. And maybe that's the real lesson, that each of us, in our own way, has the power to make a difference. Not by doing something extraordinary, but by doing the right thing at the right moment, by trusting our judgment, by acting decisively, by following the lone destroyer wherever it may lead. Because sometimes the most important decisions are the ones no one authorized, the ones that come from instinct, from experience, from a deep understanding of what needs to be done. Wade McClusky made one of those decisions, and because he did, the Battle of Midway was won, the Pacific War was turned, and history was changed. One man, one decision, one unauthorized turn. That's all it took. The training that prepared him. Wade McClusky's success at Midway didn't happen by accident. It was the result of years of training, experience, and preparation. From his earliest days at the Naval Academy, McClusky had been fascinated by navigation. While other midshipmen struggled with celestial navigation, calculating positions using the stars and sun, McClusky excelled. He could plot a course in his head, estimate drift and wind correction without instruments, and find his way back to a moving ship in the middle of the ocean. This skill would prove invaluable on June 4, 1942. When McClusky's formation arrived at the expected coordinates and found nothing, many pilots would have panicked. But McClusky remained calm. He calculated. He reasoned. He made an educated guess about where the Japanese carriers might have gone. And he was right. But navigation was only part of his training. McClusky had also spent years learning how to lead. As a junior officer, he had learned to inspire confidence in his men, to make decisions under pressure, to take responsibility for outcomes, good and bad. He had learned that leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about being the steadiest. It was about making the hard calls when no one else would. At Pensacola, during flight training, McClusky had learned the physical skills of flying. How to take off from a carrier deck, how to land on a pitching deck in rough seas, how to dive bomb with precision. But more importantly, he had learned how to think like a pilot, how to manage fuel, how to read weather, how to assess risk. All of these skills came together on June 4, 1942. When McClusky saw the destroyer, he didn't just follow it blindly. He calculated how much fuel he had left, how far he could go, how long he could search. He weighed the risks against the potential rewards. And he made the decision that his training had prepared him to make. The other pilots. Wade McClusky didn't fly alone. Behind him were 32 other dive bomber pilots, each with their own story, their own fears, their own courage. When McClusky made the decision to follow the destroyer, some of his pilots were skeptical. They could see their fuel gauges dropping. They knew that every minute they flew away from the carrier was a minute less fuel for the return trip. Some of them thought McClusky was making a mistake. But they followed him anyway, because they trusted him, because he had earned their respect through months of training and leadership, because they knew that if anyone could find the Japanese carriers, it was McClusky. Among those pilots was Lieutenant Richard Best, commander of Bombing Squadron 6. Best was an aggressive, confident pilot, known for his skill and his willingness to take risks. When McClusky found the carriers and began his dive, Best followed, targeting the Akagi. His bomb hit squarely, penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the hangar. The Akagi, the pride of the Japanese fleet, was doomed. Another pilot was Ensign Frank O'Flaherty, a young officer from Montana. O'Flaherty had only been with the squadron for a few months. This was his first major combat mission. When he saw the Japanese carriers, his hands were shaking. But he followed McClusky down, released his bomb, and pulled up. He made it back to the Enterprise with just a few gallons of fuel remaining. Not all of them were so lucky. Several pilots ran out of fuel on the return trip and had to ditch in the ocean. Some were picked up by American ships. Others were never found. But every one of them, whether they made it back or not, played a role in the victory at Midway, because they followed Wade McClusky, because they trusted his judgment, because they were willing to risk everything for the mission. The moment of doubt. There was a moment just before McClusky saw the destroyer when he almost turned back. His fuel gauge was critically low. His pilots were scattered. The ocean below was empty. He had been searching for over an hour with no results. The smart thing to do, the safe thing to do, was to turn back, to conserve fuel, to get his pilots home. But McClusky hesitated. He thought about what would happen if he turned back. The Japanese carriers would escape. They would launch their strike against the American carriers. The battle would be lost. And all those torpedo bomber pilots, all those men who had died trying to find the enemy, would have died for nothing. McClusky couldn't accept that. He couldn't turn back knowing that he hadn't done everything possible to find the enemy. So he kept searching. Just a few more minutes, he told himself. Just a little bit longer. And then he saw the destroyer. It was a small thing, just a white wake on the blue ocean. But it was enough. It was the clue he had been looking for. And in that moment, all the doubt vanished. McClusky knew what he had to do. He banked to the right and followed the destroyer. And everything changed. The Japanese carriers. The 4 Japanese carriers that McClusky found were the most powerful warships in the world. The Akagi, the flagship, had been in service since 1927. It had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, leading the strike that had crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The Kaga, another veteran carrier, had also been at Pearl Harbor. It was one of the largest carriers in the Japanese fleet, capable of carrying over 90 aircraft. The Soryu and Hiryu were newer, faster carriers, built in the 1930s. Together, these 4 carriers represented the heart of Japanese naval power. They had swept across the Pacific, destroying everything in their path. They had sunk British battleships, bombed Australian cities, and terrorized the Indian Ocean. They were commanded by experienced officers, crewed by skilled sailors, and protected by the best fighter pilots in the world. They were, by any measure, a formidable force. But on June 4th, 1942, they had one fatal weakness. They were vulnerable. Their flight decks were crowded with aircraft. Their hangar decks were packed with bombs and torpedoes. Their fuel lines were open. They were, in effect, floating bombs waiting to explode. And when Wade McClusky's dive bombers arrived, that's exactly what happened. The explosions. The explosions that destroyed the Japanese carriers were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. When McClusky's bomb hit the Kaga, it penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the hangar. The blast ignited the fuel and ammunition stored there. Secondary explosions followed, each one more powerful than the last. Bombs cooked off, sending shrapnel tearing through the ship. Torpedoes exploded, blowing holes in the hull. Fuel fires spread rapidly, consuming everything in their path. Within minutes, The Kaga was a blazing inferno. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. Smoke billowed up in thick black clouds. The heat was so intense that the steel deck plates began to buckle and warp. Men jumped overboard to escape the flames, only to be sucked under by the ship's propellers or consumed by burning oil on the water's surface. The Akagi suffered a similar fate. 3 bombs hit in quick succession. One struck near the bridge, killing several officers. Another penetrated the flight deck and detonated among the aircraft parked below. The third hit near the stern, starting fires that quickly spread throughout the ship. Admiral Nagumo, the fleet commander, was forced to evacuate the Akagi and transfer his flag to a cruiser. He watched helplessly as his flagship burned. The Soryu was hit by 3 bombs from dive bombers launched from the Yorktown. Like the Kaga and Akagi, the Soryu was quickly engulfed in flames. The crew fought desperately to save the ship, but the fires were too intense. Within hours, the Soryu was abandoned. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers had been reduced to burning wrecks. It was one of the most devastating attacks in naval history, and it had been made possible by Wade McClusky's decision to follow a lone destroyer, the return flight. The flight back to the Enterprise was almost as dangerous as the attack itself. McClusky's fuel gauge was nearly empty. He had been flying for over 4 hours. His aircraft had been hit by anti-aircraft fire. Shrapnel had torn through his fuel tank, causing a slow leak. Every minute, he was losing precious fuel. Around him, other pilots were in similar situations. Some were flying on fumes. Others had already ditched at the ocean. McClusky flew low, conserving every drop of fuel. He calculated the distance to the carrier, the wind speed, the fuel consumption rate. He knew it would be close, very close. As he approached the Enterprise, he could see other aircraft circling, waiting to land. The carrier's flight deck was busy, recovering aircraft from other squadrons. McClusky didn't have time to wait. He radioed the carrier, requesting immediate landing clearance. The flight deck crew waved him in. McClusky lined up his approach, dropped his landing gear, and came in low over the stern. His wheels touched down on the deck. The tailhook caught the arresting wire. The aircraft jerked to a stop. McClusky had made it. When he climbed out of his cockpit, his legs were shaking. His flight suit was soaked with sweat and blood from the shrapnel wound in his shoulder. His hands were cramped from gripping the control stick for so long. But he was alive. And he had just helped win the most important battle of the Pacific War, the immediate aftermath. In the hours after the attack, the full scale of the American victory became clear. 3 Japanese carriers were sinking. The 4th, the Hiryu, was still operational, but it was alone and vulnerable. That afternoon, the Hiryu launched a desperate strike against the American carriers. Japanese dive bombers and torpedo bombers found the Yorktown and attacked. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition, several Japanese aircraft got through. 3 bombs hit the Yorktown, causing severe damage. Then, a few hours later, Japanese torpedo bombers attacked again. 2 torpedoes hit the Yorktown, causing massive flooding. The carrier began to list heavily. The crew was ordered to abandon ship. But even as the Yorktown was dying, American dive bombers were hunting the Hiryu. They found it late in the afternoon and attacked. 4 bombs hit the Hiryu, setting it ablaze. Like the other Japanese carriers, the Hiryu was quickly consumed by fire. By the evening of June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers were sinking or sunk. The Japanese fleet, once the most powerful naval force in the Pacific, was in full retreat. The Battle of Midway was over, and the Americans had won a stunning victory: the strategic impact. The Battle of Midway changed the course of the Pacific War. Before Midway, the Japanese had been on the offensive, conquering territory and threatening Allied positions throughout the Pacific. After Midway, they were on the defensive. The loss of 4 fleet carriers was a blow from which the Japanese Navy never recovered. Carriers took years to build and required enormous resources. Japan simply didn't have the industrial capacity to replace them quickly. More importantly, the loss of experienced pilots and crew was irreplaceable. Japan had started the war with the best-trained naval aviators in the world. But training took time, and after Midway, Japan didn't have time. The quality of Japanese pilots declined steadily throughout the war. By 1944, many Japanese pilots had only a few months of training before being sent into combat. They were no match for the increasingly experienced American pilots. The strategic initiative also shifted. Before Midway, the United States was reacting to Japanese moves, trying to defend against Japanese attacks. After Midway, the United States went on the offensive. 2 months after Midway, American forces landed on Guadalcanal, beginning a long, bloody campaign to push the Japanese back across the Pacific. The road from Guadalcanal to Tokyo would take 3 more years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. After Midway, everyone knew that Japan would lose the war. It was just a matter of time. The personal cost. For Wade McClusky, the victory at Midway came at a personal cost. The shrapnel wound in his shoulder became infected. He spent several weeks in the hospital recovering. When he returned to duty, he was assigned to staff positions, training new pilots and developing tactics. He never flew in combat again. But the psychological cost was even greater. McClusky had seen men die. He had watched aircraft explode in mid-air. He had seen pilots ditch in the ocean, never to be found. He had made decisions that sent men to their deaths, and he carried that weight for the rest of his life. In his later years, McClusky rarely talked about Midway. When he did, he always emphasized the sacrifice of the torpedo bomber pilots. He would say that they were the real heroes, not him. He would say that he had just been doing his job. But those who knew him understood. McClusky carried the burden of command, the weight of decisions made in the heat of battle, the knowledge that his choices had determined who lived and who died. It was a burden he bore quietly, with dignity, for the rest of his life. The recognition. Wade McClusky received the Navy Cross for his actions at Midway. It was the second highest decoration for valor in the U.S. military, awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. But McClusky never wore his medals. He kept them in a drawer, rarely looking at them. When asked about them, he would shrug and say that he had just been doing his job. Other honors followed. He was promoted to captain, then to rear admiral. He was given command of air groups and training squadrons. He helped develop the tactics that would be used throughout the rest of the Pacific War. But McClusky never sought recognition. He never gave interviews. He never wrote a memoir. He just did his job, quietly and competently, until he retired in 1956. After retirement, he settled in Maryland with his wife. He worked as a consultant for defense contractors, advising on naval aviation matters. He played golf, tended his garden, and spent time with his grandchildren. He lived a quiet, ordinary life, and that's exactly how he wanted it. The lessons for today. The story of Wade McClusky and the Battle of Midway offers lessons that are still relevant today. First, the importance of preparation. McClusky's success at Midway was the result of years of training and experience. He had learned navigation, leadership, and flying. He had practiced making decisions under pressure. When the critical moment came, he was ready. Second, the importance of judgment. McClusky didn't follow orders blindly. He assessed the situation, weighed the risks, and made a decision based on his best judgment. He trusted his instincts, and he was right. Third, the importance of courage. McClusky knew that following the destroyer was a risk. He knew that he might be wrong. He knew that his pilots might run out of fuel, but he also knew that doing nothing was a greater risk. So he acted. Fourth, the importance of humility. McClusky never sought glory. He never boasted about his role in the battle. He always gave credit to others, especially the torpedo bomber pilots who had sacrificed their lives. He understood that leadership wasn't about personal glory. It was about serving something larger than yourself. These lessons are timeless. They apply not just to military leaders, but to anyone who faces difficult decisions, uncertain outcomes, and high stakes. Whether you're leading a squadron of dive bombers or leading a team in business, the principles are the same. Prepare thoroughly, trust your judgment, act courageously, and stay humble. The enduring mystery. One question about the Battle of Midway has never been fully answered. Why did Wade McClusky decide to follow the destroyer? He said later that it was the only thing that made sense. But what did he see that others didn't? What made him think that the destroyer would lead him to the carriers? Some historians believe that McClusky's decision was based on pure logic. Destroyers don't operate alone. They escort larger ships. If a destroyer was moving at high speed, it must be going somewhere important. Therefore, follow it. Others believe that McClusky's decision was based on intuition, a gut feeling that couldn't be explained by logic alone. He had been flying for hours, searching desperately for the enemy, and when he saw the destroyer, something clicked. He just knew. Still others believe that McClusky's decision was based on desperation. He was running out of fuel. He was running out of time. He had to make a choice. And following the destroyer was the only option that offered any hope of success. The truth is probably a combination of all three. Logic, intuition, and desperation all played a role. But whatever the reason, McClusky's decision was the right one. And that's what matters. The alternative history. It's worth considering what would have happened if McClusky had made a different decision. If he had turned back when his fuel was low, the dive bombers would have returned to the Enterprise without finding the Japanese carriers. The torpedo bomber attacks would have failed. The Japanese would have launched their strike against the American carriers. With 4 Japanese carriers attacking 3 American carriers, the odds would have favored the Japanese. The Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown would likely have been hit, possibly sunk. Even if some of the American carriers survived, they would have been damaged and forced to withdraw. The Japanese would have won the Battle of Midway. They would have captured the atoll. They would have established a base within striking distance of Hawaii. The psychological impact would have been enormous. After Pearl Harbor and 6 months of defeats, another major loss would have been devastating to American morale. The war in the Pacific would have lasted much longer. Instead of going on the offensive at Guadalcanal in August 1942, the United States would have been forced to remain on the defensive, rebuilding its carrier fleet and waiting for reinforcements. The Japanese would have had time to consolidate their conquests, fortify their positions, and prepare for the next phase of the war. Tens of thousands more lives would have been lost. The atomic bombs, when they were finally developed, might have been used differently. The post-war world would have looked very different, all because of one decision, one unauthorized turn. That's the weight of history. That's the burden that leaders carry. One decision, made in a moment of uncertainty, can change everything. The final flight. Wade McClusky flew his last combat mission on June 4, 1942. After Midway, he was assigned to staff positions and training duties. He never again climbed into the cockpit of a dive bomber and dove toward an enemy ship. But in a way, he didn't need to. He had already made his mark. He had already changed history. In his later years, McClusky would sometimes think about that day, about the empty ocean, the dropping fuel gauge, the lone destroyer, about the decision he made, the dive he flew, the bombs that fell, about the men who didn't come home. And he would wonder, what if he had turned back? What if he hadn't seen the destroyer? What if the bombs had missed? But then he would shake his head and push those thoughts away, because what-ifs don't matter. What matters is what actually happened. And what happened was that Wade McClusky, a quiet officer from Buffalo, New York, made a decision that changed the course of the Pacific War. He followed a lone destroyer. He found the Japanese carriers. He dove, and he changed history. That's his legacy. Not the medals, not the promotions, not the recognition, but the decision. The unauthorized turn. The moment when everything hung in the balance and one man made the right choice. That's what we remember. That's what we honor. That's what we learn from. Because in the end, history is made by individuals, by people making decisions, by people taking risks, by people trusting their judgment. Wade McClusky was one of those people, and the world is better because of him.